Welcome to Wisdom for Life, where we sift through philosophy to find practical advice that you can use in your everyday life. Hi, I'm Dan Hayes, and I'm joined by my co-host, Dr. Greg Sadler. Today we're talking about
stakeholders versus stockholders, and this is a set of ideas that come out originally in the field of business ethics and corporate governance, so this may sound a little abstruse to some of our listeners at first, but trust me, we've got a lot of great stuff for how this actually does apply to ordinary life and the decision-making that we're involved, taking it out of the sphere of business. You don't have to be a executive or manager or own a company in order to make this useful. And now, Dan, this is an idea that you proposed that we should talk about. What was your original impetus for proposing this? Because it's been a little while, and I don't quite remember.
I think we were talking about the different ways our systems that we've set up benefit who in the society, and like obviously this is directly related to ethics, because ethics is in part a study about how we ought to treat each other, and so we're going to be talking about some normative things, which are things that one ought to do within a system. Based on that system. And so if you have a system that says that you, ought to kick cats, then it is normative for you to kick cats.
We should avoid that one.
Yeah, I think that's a bad system. But just because there are systems and they are normative doesn't mean that they are good in and of themselves. And so we have a number of systems that we already have in place. And we should look at them, and like every system is not good in of itself. Just because it's the current system we have, we should go through regular review and see if they are still actually beneficial to us as a society.
Yeah, and so with talking about shareholders and stakeholders, at least in the business environment, there's a lot of talk at times about stakeholders, and we'll discuss exactly what that idea is and who it covers in just a minute. But it seems like in a lot of cases, the primary attention is still what can we do for shareholders. So we should clarify what we mean by shareholders, those who have a stake, because stakeholders is a broader concept. So are we just talking about people who own a part of a company or derive some sort of, legally defined benefits from the company, or what do you take?
This? Yeah, I guess it is, stakeholders versus shareholders, and yes, all shareholders are stakeholders, but this is a Venn diagram where the one circle is completely subsumed or encapsulated within the other, whereas the for the stakeholders are all those people who have a vested interest in the activities and the decision-making of that organization. Usually we talk about this in reference to businesses, but we'll see at some point in time that these things become more actionable on much different types of organizations. And so some of those people that are stakeholders are owners, obviously the ones that we just talked about, but also the employees, the managers, otherwise sometimes referred to as agents within the business community, the customers, society, creditors, suppliers, the government, and, customers again. But those are like some of the core stakeholders, and we can talk about other stakeholders that are even more far-flung, but I feel like it's going to get a little bit far from what we need to talk about right now to make this distinction.
Yeah, and that was a concept. So the notion of stakeholder has been getting a lot of traction, say, over the last 40 years or so. As a matter of fact, there was even some sort of big conference, and I don't remember what it was. It was pre-COVID, and it was, the big muckety-mucks of corporations and governments getting together to talk about stakeholder capitalism and the need to be, attentive to how other people were being affected besides those who own a share in a company. Some of these are probably more important, employees. You can't run a company without employees. So if your decision making is continually trying to, here's a motto that they like, do more with less, right? I mean, at a certain point, you're doing damage to the people that are actually working for you. Or you could be selling out your customers. You could be exploiting them. And if you really treat them as a stakeholder, as somebody who has what we call in ethics moral standing, whose outcomes you have to care about, you have to take into consideration, well, you can't screw over your customers as part of your business model. Suppliers, if you treat them badly, as some corporations do. Walmart is a great example of a corporation that would really stick it to suppliers because they had so much weight in the market. That would be treating a stakeholder very badly. And it's interesting that you bring up the government too, because you don't see that a lot in business ethics textbooks, but businesses pay taxes, or at least they should be. And that should be part of, the conception of a stakeholder. And of course, the taxes are supposed to be doing things for other people who could fit into other classes here. But that does seem to be quite important.
And it seems like this came about, you said, it started becoming kind of, in the last 40 years, but there's been a ramp up of it. And
yeah.
It's become this new thing that we're talking about, not because it's particularly a new idea, because it's
right.
But that in the last 30, 40 years, our economy, at least here in the United States, has become increasingly more towards the side of shareholder supremacy. That everything has to be only in reference to the shareholder. And so this has resulted in a number of really negative outcomes for a lot of people within businesses in our society. And so people are like, okay, something's wrong. Something is breaking here. What is the reasoning behind this? And so a lot of people are saying that we are not actually building those businesses in a way that are actually sustainable for the workforce and are actually beneficial for the community. And so you see,
one of the ones that we talked about a while back was casinos. They're always pitched as, this is going to be a great boon for the community. It's going to provide 1,000 or 2,000 jobs. And, it'll bring tourist dollars in. And, what the studies show is that oftentimes over the long run, casinos wind up being a net loss, not for the shareholders who do great. They make tons of money because the house always wins. But the employees don't get good jobs out of it. And it winds up really affecting the local community by bringing a lot of people in who spend their money imprudently and wind up having bad outcomes as a result. I think if I remember right, when we looked at that, we did see that the government quite often gets its share. So you could say that stakeholders doing just fine, but the others are not. Yeah.
Yeah. And so, and obviously a big stakeholder is the people that are around them. So, for example, you talk about big industry and whatnot, and if you're, constantly polluting the stakeholders of the society that lives directly around where your facilities, their quality of life might be going down. They're not paying for it. This is usually referred to as a negative externality, but the people that live right next to your factory are very much affected by your decisions within your company.
Yeah.
So those are your stakeholders.
And depending on what kind of pollution we're talking about, prime example of this from in the past was up in the Fox Valley, there were a lot of paper mills. And, now they're more environmentally friendly, but in the 50s, they sure as hell weren't. And so by the time the Fox River actually got down by Waukesha, if you were to swim in it, you were really taking your life in your hands. It was so polluted that people would get burned, from all these things that were in it.
I'm surprised they didn't get paper cuts.
Yeah, if the water got thick enough, I suppose, right?
Sorry.
And they've done some jobs in cleaning it up and removing that. But, you could have a pollutant that is hundreds of miles away. And a lot of times they didn't even really think about it when they started doing that, So now you mentioned expanded ideas of stakeholders, and we do talk about this in business ethics classes, which, by the way, I'm going to be teaching again this semester. I got called in kind of last minute to take on another section of business ethics at Marquette. And this is actually something that we begin with in week 1. So who else could be a stakeholder? Who could be affected by the decisions you're making? So, you've got the local community. So, we're here in Milwaukee. If we do something that negatively affects or positively affects the local community, that's good or bad. But we could also be affecting people all over the place, the larger global community. And then, another thing, and I think this is a fascinating one to consider, future generations. We often don't think very far ahead, or if we do, we do it in very abstract terms, like, oh, we're going to create jobs. Well, okay. How long are those jobs going to be around? Are they the sort of thing where the current crop of employees could actually potentially retire from those jobs and their kids could step in, or are you just talking about a job that has at most a 5-year horizon? And then some people, and I'd be curious to see what you think about this idea, Dan, because I'm kind of conflicted about it. The environment can be considered a stakeholder. That to me seems pretty tricky to assess, right? Because are you talking about like all the animals and the plants, or are you putting them all together in one big thing that we call like capital E environment? Or do we take into account, like they have done in some countries, giving like rivers legal rights and treating them as essentially entities, or formations in the natural world that are sacred to particular indigenous peoples? I don't know. I think the verdict is still kind of out on that one. But what do you think about that?
It's weird to think about the different ways that you could consider why does the environment have value or moral worth in these things. Is the environment only have the moral worth because we need it to sustain ourselves? If we would destroy our environment, it's bad for us, either our enjoyment or our ability to live in it, and thus that makes it bad? Or is it something that has moral worth in and of itself and not as just a means to our own happiness and being able to live?
Yeah.
And so, depending on how you answer that question, I feel like there's kind of different answers to like how I feel about that.
Well, that makes perfect sense, right? Mm-hmm. Making distinctions and then saying, if you mean this, I've got different answers. That's what we do in philosophy all the time.
Right.
Rather than say, well, we've got the one blanket answer to everything. That's usually how we get in a lot of trouble.
Yeah. Sometimes the best answer is, it depends. And it's okay that it depends. Yeah. Also, sometimes it's okay to say, you don't know. And let's investigate.
That's true. Yeah. Now we're getting into sort of methodology about stuff here, yeah. But which is taking us a little bit far from our original topic. But it's good stuff to talk about, though.
Yeah. Maybe for another time. But let's talk about stakeholder theory.
Yeah. Lead us through what that actually means, because I think a lot of people hearing that, their eyes might be glazing over already. Mm-hmm. What the hell are you? What do you mean by that?
And so there's definitely like the detractors of this, especially at least from a kind of a high level view. It's like, oh yeah, you need to be aware of the decisions and the how things affect those people that are not just the shareholders, but also the employers and managers and customers and society. But like you'll have people that are like followers of like Milton Friedman that say like, oh no, this is already built into the shareholder theory, that if you're going to maximize for the shareholder, that's automatically going to make you maximize for these other people, because if you don't have good workers, then you're going to reduce your long-term profits. If you don't take care of your customers are going to leave you. If you're not worried about your managers, then you're going to lose your investment. All these things that say like, hey, this is already dealt with, but there are some like three major things here that really make the foundations of stakeholders theory different than stockholder theory.
You know, since we mentioned Friedman, I just want to say just a little bit about him and the piece that always gets brought up. So he had this short editorial called "The Social Responsibility of Business is to Increase Its Profits." And this was written in 1970. So this is going back quite a ways. And, you know, a lot of the businesses at the time were saying things like, you know, we should avoid raising our prices even though inflation is becoming an issue because we don't want to contribute to that problem. Or we should make sure that our employees are really well taken care of. Or, you know, we've got this social responsibility to do that. And Friedman was saying, no. That is a bad idea. You're in effect taxing your customers or, you know, transferring these costs to other people. The motto, the social responsibility of business is to increase its profits. Now, what goes into that? The assumption of what will later be called trickle-down economics. The idea that if you are making a business more profitable and thereby paying out to a select few of usually rich people who are the shareholders, they're going to spend more money, they're going to invest it, they're going to look out for society. So the business shouldn't be doing that. As a matter of fact, that's a bad thing from Friedman's perspective. And what you're relying on there is rich people to do their fair share. And the track record of that is pretty poor, over the last 50 years. And it's interesting to see that a lot of the things that many people would have considered a business's or a owner's social responsibility have been progressively pared away, so that I think there's a lot of people now who think I don't have any responsibility to the world, the public, my local community, my employees, any of that sort of stuff. I just got to maximize profits.
And I think you and I are in agreement that that is not going to result in the best outcomes.
Not even close to the best, I think we can say, I mean, because we don't want to say, let's get rid of capitalism altogether. That's not feasible right now. But we certainly don't want, the kind of monopoly capitalism, or as we often call it, crony or corrupt capitalism that takes place. And, where for example, and then I realize we're getting a little in the weeds, so we got to come back to stakeholder theory. I think that there's businesses out there in the present, for example, in healthcare or the insurance industry, where their business model is predicated on making it as difficult as possible for people to actually access the care that they've paid for. And that provides them with profitability. Now, that's an evil way to go about things, Now, is it a bad thing from a shareholder perspective? This is what's wrong with the shareholder perspective. It can't say that's a bad thing to do. But if you are deliberately screwing over your customers and maybe even your employees who use your services, that's bad. That's wrong.
Yeah. Well, since we're talking about this, I'm gonna just give us a background. So stakeholder theory or stockholder theories, major ones there are agency theories, or the agency theory, where managers, those people that are working for the stockholders, so this is your CEO or your corporate suite, your C-suite, as well as all those people that work as managers down the line. But those are your main people; those are your main agents that are working in your interest as a stockholder. So managers are ethically obliged to advance the financial interests of corporate shareholders in preference to the interests of other stakeholders. That is, the managers have an exclusive fiduciary obligation to shareholders.
Yeah. And I think those are two key things, right? So a manager doesn't have to say, I'm deliberately going to screw everybody except for the shareholders, right? They could even be beneficial in some ways to various stakeholders. Like, I'm going to do some things for the employees, but the employees will always come last compared to the stockholders, or the customer will always come last in comparison to them.
Right. And so this does not make it so that you're always screwing over everyone, but it does allow you to screw over anyone as long as it's going to be in pursuit of a larger bottom line.
Yeah.
And so if you can get away with it, it's cool, kind of is the idea here.
I think you can say too that if you're not considering stakeholders in general as being not necessarily as important as the stockholders, but pretty close, whatever model you have is probably not going to be sustainable over time, right? Because things wind up being very, we'll call it extractive, Mm-hmm. Whereas if you want to have a company that's going to be around for generations, you have to have a workforce that actually wants to be there and continue working for you. You have to have customers who feel like you're not the only game in town and they're grudgingly going along with you, because as soon as there's an innovation, they're going to leave you for that other new company.
Yeah,
so
if you know your business history, this is kind of the difference between before and after Jack Welch at GE.
Oh, yeah.
Before, you had GE was the largest company in the United States, if not the world, and it provided tens of thousands of family supporting jobs. You had people that would spend their entire lives working for GE, have a good pension, be able to live a good life working for a company that saw them as partners in producing this wealth. And then after Jack Welch, it turned into a very extractive model that was for a shareholder primacy, or that the exclusive fiduciary responsibility to shareholders at the expense of everyone else, including things like stack ranking for the employees, where basically they said every manager every year has to rank all the employees under them and fire the bottom 10%, which then turns everything in that organization from a cooperative model to a combative model.
One. Yeah.
And so not only does it potentially lower wages, it reduces morale. There's lots of really negative results from some of these very stockholder first priorities.
Yeah. I think that another thing that contributes to it is something that took off very much so in the late 70s and has continued on today, which is the ability of companies to engage in mergers and acquisitions and buy up all sorts of other companies. So you see this, for example, in the medical field, where in the past, I don't know if we talked about this before, but it's actually one of my rants. In the past, a hospital was its own kind of institution, and it might have been profitable or it might have operated at a deficit, but But the whole goal of it were the goals of medicine: to alleviate pain, to alleviate suffering, to promote health, to keep people from, dying early, all those sorts of things. And so they could serve a bunch of different stakeholders quite naturally doing that. And then when hospitals were able to start forming into groups by buying up other hospitals and becoming essentially companies, and we had like a healthcare sector of the economy. And then, venture capital got into it, and you could have like people who are just interested as stockholders in buying their way into a medical group and then seeing profits come out of that. Well, we started seeing a lot of corners being cut, under the guise of cutting costs. And so people weren't getting the medication that they needed, or the tests, or the procedures. And doctors were not being treated all that well. Nurses were often treated worse
terribly
when they become, merely employees, right? And it leads to worse outcomes overall when you have to worry about, well, if I go to this place, am I actually going to get decent care, or is everybody there burnt out and just like holding on? That's not the fault of those people, nor even necessarily the immediate hospital administrators. It's the fault of the larger extractive organization, which lost its original goal of healing people and became about making money. And, we can say similar things about educational institutions when they're more interested in like building their endowment than they are in serving the students or holding on to their staff and faculty and treating them well. And the board is going along with this. Essentially, the board or the C-suite, you've got the president and chancellor and, upper level VPs, but, the board are the people who actually get to sign off on the big decisions. Education ceases to be the central telos or purpose or goal, and it becomes about, prestige or making money or whatever else it's going to be.
One thing that you said was like really central to this whole idea of stakeholder versus stockholder, and you said to turn nurses into merely employees. And the fact that you just said merely employees says a lot about the value of our system that sees employees as of little value and disposable.
And interchangeable, too.
Yeah. And so that is from a shareholder perspective, totally fine. It's like you drop dead tomorrow, they're going to go find someone else to fill your place. They don't care. For the most part. Whereas a stakeholder idea of how things are made, these no longer a merely employee is nothing to scoff at. The employee is now a partner and not something to have to just manage.
A mere employee, you could say, becomes a contradiction in terms, right? Because if they are an employee and you actually do take employee outcomes and morale and that sort of thing seriously, then the mere can't be applying to them.
Right. It is a category error.
Yeah, that's interesting.
So I guess coming back to, so now we've talked about like, agency theory about like this, stockholder supremacy. It's a little bit hard to make sure that I'm saying one and not the other.
Yeah.
But in stakeholder theory, in contrast to that, there are three major principles of this, and the first one is that the managers or the agents do not have an exclusive fiduciary obligation to shareholders. So this is the opposite of what we just said. It is to distribute the fruits of the organizational success and potential failure among all legitimate stakeholders. And so actually I want to add one thing in. The reason why the idea of the shareholder agency model was so prevalent is just like this supremacy of private property, and if you are putting money into a thing, you are the last one to get paid out. Like all your employees, you have a contract with, and you pay them a flat rate, whatever their contract is. But then any profits that accrue to the thing automatically go to the stake or the shareholders, and so that's this reason why they have these values set in place, because they're the ones that have like the skin in the game. And to totally dismiss the workers, their time, their energy, their mental health, their physical health, depending on the job, are not having skin in the game, it seems just a mismatch of reality, because we're just looking at things from a very narrow point of view.
Yeah, that's quite interesting, because employees very often, even in dysfunctional organizations, will exhibit a sense of, let's call it pride or partial ownership over what's happening. Or sometimes when things go bad with a company, they will feel guilt or responsibility for how decisions that they didn't have any part in, that were made at a much higher level, affect, say, the customer. I remember riding on a Greyhound bus down to Chicago, and there I would transfer to get down to my graduate school in Carbondale in Illinois. And I was sitting next to an older guy, and he was a tradesman. He'd worked on a lot of concrete stuff. And I think he was near retirement or maybe already retired. And as we were passing, going from Milwaukee down to Chicago, he would point at a building and he'd say, "That's my building." And I'd be like, "What, you own it?" And he's like, "No, I worked on it. I helped build that building." Now, he understood, of course, that he didn't build the whole building, right? He did some parts in it, but he felt like, invested. Like it was he'd given some of himself, and that gave him the right to say, this is mine. And I think that's often lacking to a lot of employees nowadays, where, nobody cares about what happens to them. And and at the same time, oftentimes the bosses are expecting them. We're all one big happy family here. You should actually care about this. And probably the most egregious case that's been, it's a long time ago now at this point. I want to say almost 20 years, is Enron. But we still teach it in business classes, in part because Enron actually had an award-winning 70-page code of ethics, which of course they didn't follow because they allowed exceptions to it, and then they made exceptions about everything. But the saddest part of Enron was that the employees had been encouraged to buy Enron stock, to invest in the company, right? So it was a way of sort of pretending to treat them as stakeholders by actually treating them as minor shareholders, when the executives knew that they were cooking the books and that sooner or later everything was going to collapse. And many of the employees
buy it was just pumping the stock up anyways.
Exactly. And a lot of them lost their entire life savings. Everything that they had, they'd invested in this company because they thought it was legit. Yeah. And when it went belly up, it really ruined a lot of people's lives in the South.
It's the difference between the speech acts versus the actual actions of an organization. You can say we're all a happy family and that we're all here to support each other, but if your actual actions and the fruits of the labor of the organization do not match these speech acts, then you're going to have a problem. People are not going to believe you. If you're actually going to give some of the profits back to the people, to treat them with the respect and dignity that at least a human requires, then you saying these things is just making everyone think that you're a liar, because a lot of times you are, and you're just trying to extract value out of that labor without actually giving the due pay for that labor that has been required.
That's right, yeah. And you're depriving people when you're engaging in deception. This is something that Norman Bowie, who is a business ethicist associated with what's often called Kantian capitalism. He points out that when deception is taking place on the part of management or the executives in relation to the employees, you are treating somebody as a mere means to whatever end that you want. You're not treating them with human dignity. And it's interesting because you think about Immanuel Kant's ethical theory. It's very abstract, seems very rigorous and hard to apply, but Bowie, I think, very successfully shows how it would be applied within the day-to-day context of ordinary businesses.
Yeah, that formulation of the categorical imperative is one that I use as a crutch. Like whenever I'm like looking at a new ethical dilemma, it's like, okay, whose ends am I working for here?
Yeah.
So the second principle that is different from our previous stakeholder agency theory stockholder agency theory, is that stakeholders should have input in the decision-making process of the organization. This gives them buy-in, and there are moral obligations to each of these stakeholders. If you don't have the input that is going to be a bad outcome for one of these stakeholders, then it's easy to make a decision without any pushback. So, for example, in Germany, every company has on their board at least one member that represents the actual workers. And so at the highest level of decision-making within the company, there is at least one, if not more, people at the table with voting rights that are there representing the wherewithal, the values, the needs of the employees.
Yeah, that's a great example. I can think of another interesting example with a distinction. So imagine that you've got a whole bunch of employees and there's customers and you are involved in management. Now, one thing you could say to the employees, you gather them all together in a room and you're like, customers are the absolute backbone of our cash flow. Without them, there's no Acme company, right? So you had better treat those customers well. The customer is always right. I don't care what it takes. You go the extra mile to make sure the customers are happy. Now, it looks like you're acknowledging a stakeholder group, right? The customers. And maybe there's something legitimate to that, right? Now, some customers are bad customers, of course, so you don't want to be quite so sweeping. But what you're doing is you're taking your employees and you're treating them as if they're mere cogs in a machine there to treat the customers, right? And you could say similar things for the suppliers. You employees had better treat the suppliers as if they are the best people on earth. And if you don't, we're going to punish you. Well, then again, you're acknowledging one set of stakeholders and ignoring another one. What would be more important is
not even ignoring, but like going to give negative consequences to be harsh against.
Yeah. Exploiting, right? Dominating. So with the buy-in, you can explain to employees who aren't totally burnt out already. And now, a lot of employees are because they've been mistreated, right? So it's like people who have been in bad relationships. But let's say you've got some pretty fresh employees, they're willing to listen, and you're like, why do we actually care about these customers? Why do we actually care about the local community? Let's think this through. And you invite them into a conversation and you actually listen to them when they're like, well, what about the customers who are jerks to us? And you're like, oh, that's a good question. Let's actually think about why they still kind of matter, but you can lay down certain limits. You can go find a manager who will deal with the BS that these people are bringing to the table. Well, that's a totally different situation, right? Now you're treating employees as if they do matter as other people, and you're treating them as legitimate stakeholders rather than just as somebody else who's going to be sacrificed to these stakeholders.
Mm-hmm. And so the final of these principles is this idea between normative stakeholders and derivative stakeholders. And so it's just kind of like trying to take, we know that we have a larger set of stakeholders than just shareholders, but there's definitely like a first tier and then kind of a second tier. And the first tier they kind of agree on are financiers, the employees, the customers, the suppliers, and the local communities.
Yeah.
And so these are the people in which these two first things have to be applied to. So this is, once again, the agents or the managers have a fiduciary obligation to these normative stakeholders, and the stakeholders, these normative stakeholders, should have input in the decision-making process of the organization. Or, put it another way, from Hasanas, he says that managers of an organization do not have an exclusive fiduciary duty to any one stakeholder group, but rather are obligated to ensure that the value created by the organization is distributed among all normative stakeholders, and that a normative stakeholder have input into the managerial decisions that determine how the organization attempts to create that value. Normative stakeholders include the organization's financiers, employers, customers, suppliers, and local community.
And now you can think, well, man, I wouldn't want to be a manager there. I got to listen to too many people. Mm-hmm. But I don't think it's actually that difficult if you are to be a good manager involves being a good communicator, mm-hmm. Not just like ordering people around, but, producing, like you said, buy-in and consensus.
Yeah. And if you're only getting one voice, and you're only going to get a very small amount of the actual full picture, it's kind of like a lot of
point.
Images like on your TV are going to be made up of red, green, and blue little LEDs or little pixels of some sort. And if only the red ones are lighting up, you're going to get a much different picture than you are going to get if the rest of them show up. So the fuller picture gives you better information, which if you're getting better information, you're probably going to get better information that gives you better ability to make better decisions that are going to actually be better for the long-term viability of the organization, as well as profits within that organization, if that is the point of the organization.
That's right, yeah. I mean, there's so many companies that have screwed themselves over by allowing managers and executives to essentially dictate what's going to happen without ever listening to employees or customers. Even, suppliers play an important role in that. If your supplier says, listen, we just can't keep up with the pace as you're scaling up and provide quality, and you don't listen to them, boy, you're going to run into a lot of problems,
Yeah. And so I guess there's also a couple of sub-theories within stakeholder theory. And so these, we just went through the principles, but then there's a subset that kind of tries to be descriptive. The descriptive empirical sub-theory, which tries to describe and explain how current corporate behaviors actually work in a different setups of how they are run. And so what happens when you have a purely shareholder led organization versus maybe a shareholder stakeholder one, or maybe some quite different one. Maybe you have a organization that is completely run by the employees at the detriment to other people within the organization. How does that change governments and outcomes? And then there's also Go ahead. I was just going to finish these off really quick, and then so instrumental is used to identify the connections or lack of connections between stakeholder management and the achievements of traditional corporate objectives, usually profitability and growth. And then there's normative, which is used to interpret the function of the corporation, including the identification of moral or philosophical guidelines for the operation and the management of those corporations.
Yeah. I was going to say with the descriptive, very often what we're doing there are what we call case studies, where we set out the information and then we start to analyze it and say, well, did this actually work? Did this work? Who got left out? Who got perhaps more than their fair share? It's difficult to have a purely descriptive approach anymore. And it's very difficult to have a purely normative approach either, but yeah. Since you brought up moral theories, I thought, there's a number that are kind of the big heavy hitters when we're doing applied ethics. And typically we talk about 5, but I'll just bring up 4 here. We talk about utilitarianism, which we've discussed before, and you can express that pretty simply by saying that what you're trying to do is maximize positive outcomes and minimize negative outcomes for everybody concerned and balance those out. And that's a very common approach in business ethics. We also talk about deontological ethics, where we're looking at, rights or rules or duties, and we're saying there are certain lines that you can't cross. And so we mentioned Immanuel Kant. He's a great example of a deontological thinker. And then we have virtue ethics, where we're more concerned with the motivation and character of the people who are making the decisions and about what we're doing to other people's characters. So if we're impoverishing people, we may be generating situations where it's more difficult for them to do that. And we can talk about corporate character or corporate culture as well. And then a more recently identified thing is what we call ethics of care, which is coming out of feminist ethics. And that also brings something to the table. And every one of these can inform how we look at stakeholders. I think utilitarianism, super, super straightforward, right? Everybody's outcomes count. And so stakeholder theory from the very beginning is going to naturally harmonize quite well with utilitarianism in its classic forms. And I think that deontological ethics really provides a nice supplement, because you could think of it as like a guardrail. So, you've got your utilitarian cost-benefit analysis. Let's try to make things work out the best. But, maybe we could do that by enslaving somebody or, humiliating somebody or throwing somebody down a well, or torturing kittens or stuff like that. And deontology will come and say, no, you cannot do that. You have to respect human dignity, or you have to allow people to have autonomy, or you can't use people just merely as means to an end, or you have a duty to people. So I think those two, they don't have to be opposed to each other. They're often really effective when we pair them. And then virtue ethics adds another really important dimension. We think about who we are as people, and are we genuinely good people or bad people or somewhere in between? And what do we have to do in order to build a consistent character that will take stakeholders into consideration, right? What does it mean to be somebody, be a manager who actually cares about their employees, And then this leads us to ethics of care. That is really good for focusing on the people who might be otherwise falling through the cracks or marginalized or viewed as not that important, and saying we need to have concern for them. We need to empathize with them and treat situations a bit more particularly. And I think these moral theories, they don't have to be, it's not like you have to pick one and then you only go with that one. That's where a lot of people go wrong in ethics. They're like, I'm a utilitarian. I only care about that, right? You want to put all of these together in kind of like a toolbox, I would say.
Well, you got to be a little bit careful about that, because the more tools you have, the more outs you can potentially give yourself. It's like I can use the worst portions of this tool.
Yeah.
But that is going far afield from the topic we're getting at. But I wanted to yes and you on the utilitarian. Even the utilitarians had deontological ideas based on the idea that okay, how do you actually put utilitarianism into action? You have a group of people that try to figure out what the what actions had the most utility, and then say like,
That's
hey,
right, yeah,
in these things, you do these, and that just, for the rest of us who aren't sitting around trying to figure out what maximizes well-being or happiness there, it's like, oh, well, they already figured this out. You do this in this situation. That's very deontological.
Yeah. As a little bit of trivia, the very first use of the word deontology, as far as I know, is actually by Jeremy Bentham, the father of utilitarianism. He wrote a book called Deontology because it means like the study of our duties, right? And in it, I think he basically, from what I remember, it's been over 10 years since I've read it, he basically took his earlier writings and just kind of reformulated them. So it's utilitarianism called deontology.
Interesting. So, and when we talk about ethics here, like the whole reason why stakeholder theory, one of the main reasons we talk about it in these ethical terms is because there is this thing called the separation fallacy, which is the fallacious belief that business and ethics are separate realms. And it's like the whole idea of like, right. This is just business. No, you can never, strip out ethics from business. You can be a businessman and you're still an a-hole. But it doesn't make you not an a-hole for just doing things that were business.
I've been thinking about a different kind of fallacy that this would fit into that I've observed when people get called on a particular thing. So this would apply really well to business people who are unscrupulous and do unethical things and then have the excuse, well, I'm just maximizing shareholder value, So when you point out to somebody that they're being a jerk in a certain way, they're doing something wrong, they will oftentimes say, oh, I'm not doing X, I'm doing Y. And if you actually look at the thing closely, you're like, well, you are still doing X because Y leads to X, and it's explaining how you wound up doing X, and you are also doing Y, but you're doing both of them at the same time. So I'm just maximizing shareholder value, yes, by robbing the employees of their pension fund or whatever it happens to be. You're still robbing them of their pension fund, right? And the fact that you call it maximizing shareholder value or making prudent decision or cutting costs doesn't mean that you're not doing this other thing over here. And people try this sort of thing all the time. They do it in interpersonal conflict where they're like, oh, I'm not attacking you. I'm just defending myself, right? And you're like, well, you're defending yourself by attacking me. So, yeah. It's
this moral gymnastics. Like, how can I?
Oh, that's a good word.
What's our new standard? And if you agree with this standard, then I'm fine. But we're not talking about that standard. If you're talking about like our relationship, that's a totally different standard, and you've now transgressed that. But now we talk to the point where how do you actually apply this in your life? And especially if you're not like working in a large corporation or something, or already in a place of power within these things, how do you actually utilize this information? So when we're talking about stakeholder theory, and this does not only apply to businesses, it applies to organizations that are voluntary associations that have three characteristics. They're formed to realize specific aims and purposes. 2, that they allow members to freely exit and freely eject other members from the association. And 3, that attract and retain, as well as recruit and evaluate members on the basis of their interest in advancing the association's objectives. So
this could be like a gaming club, for example, right?
Absolutely.
People who get together on a Saturday night to play D&D or something like that.
Yeah, the objective is to play this game together, and what is the win condition of D&D? It's to come back and play it the next week.
Oh, that's, I never heard that. That's a good one.
Yeah, that is definitely the answer. It's like, you don't win D&D. You keep on doing the thing that you like. But like, all the way from like corporations to the government to a union to, you got a political action committee, or you've got like a homeowners association, or a gardening club, or whatever.
Yeah, that's quite interesting. So the stakeholders won't be just one sort of uniform thing, like, suppliers, creditors, employees. In each of these cases, we would have to say, okay, well, who actually are the stakeholders for this particular group? So like the D&D club, it could be the place that they play at. It could be, that's providing them with a spot, like a gaming place, the players themselves, maybe the game organizer in D&D, the GM, but, it could be some other person would be like at the level of like a manager, maybe. And then you'd also have to think about like, well, who are the other stakeholders, the families of these people? Like if they're nerding out 24 hours a day, maybe that's negatively impacting their family, right?
So, for example, I go and I play D&D at my friend's house, but they've got 2 young kids. And so we have to make sure that we are relatively quiet because we play after they go to bed.
Yeah.
To not wake them up. They are stakeholders in this thing, even though they're like 2, So it's just,
even like pets, like dogs that need to be walked at a certain time could be stakeholders in that. So like if you're sitting at the table and the dog's over in the corner whining and you're not attending to its needs, you're not meeting the obligation to one of your important stakeholders.
Or if your organization is to have a party on Friday nights,
okay,
then now you have stakeholders that are your neighbors. And are you going to be annoying your neighbors?
Yeah,
but having a party and having guests fits into this criteria of who does it apply. It's an organization that has a goal to have a party.
I think this could actually work. So this group wouldn't necessarily fit all those criteria that you laid out, but I think it could apply to families. You can voluntarily leave a family, but that's a higher exit cost, let's say.
Yeah, that's hard. There's lots of friction there.
But I think it is really important in families to figure out who the stakeholders are. And they could be like your neighbors, or they could be people who you pay to do things, So I think this is an idea of very wide application. And the general idea, just to like bring it to a close, because we're going to run out of time pretty soon, is you got to take everybody's outcomes into account if you want to adopt a stakeholder point of view.
Yeah. And obviously it's going to take a little bit more work. Like it's great, to be the boss and to like, rain down dictates from like heaven, but like, if you actually want people to freely be there, like this is one of the things. It's an organization that people can freely enter and exit, and if no one wants to follow whatever you're saying from high, they're just going to leave.
And it's something that you also have to continually like retune. You can't fix it once and for all, and then I've addressed every stakeholder, because there may be some new ones showing up, or
the environment's going to change in some way, and it's going to change what people are wanting, or there's new pressures coming on them from whatever. So if you're not in these regular conversations with all the stakeholders, then you're not going to be able to meet their needs, and they're going to leave your organization.
That is a great point. Well, do you want to take us out on a final thought? I think we're getting close to the...
Yeah. We leave you today with the words of Robert Reich. In the 1980s, corporate raiders began mounting unfriendly takeovers of companies that could deliver higher returns to their shareholders, but only if they abandoned their own stakeholders.